Storytelling is not just about sharing the story, it's about listening to your audience. Then you share the story and then you take action.
What's your company's story? Does it inspire and instruct team members to create a positive work culture that grows people and profits? I'm Dr. Joey Faucette, host of the Work Positive podcast, here to help you do one thing today that creates a positive work culture so you grow people and profits. You know, we all have a story, and your company does too. It's just a matter of, is your company story the one you want told? My guest today on this episode of the Work Positive podcast is here to help you lead your company to tell the best story possible in the most engaging manner possible so you architect the best culture possible. She's reached more than 10,000 people from LA to Istanbul and in 3 different languages, en français, English, and Italiano. Get ready for some thought-provoking genius and empowering storytelling skill development so you grow people and profits on this episode of the Work Positive podcast. So Work Positive Nation, are you ready to hear some amazing stories and learn how you can tell your own stories? I sure am. I really am. Help me welcome to this episode of the Work Positive podcast, Beatrice Ngalula Kabutakapua. How did I do? Did I do well? I mean,
It was
I grew
okay.
up eating grits, so it's really hard for me to say certain words, but you're absolutely amazing. Thank you. You're Italian by descent and in London, UK right now.
Yes, I was born in Italy. My parents are from Congo. I live in London now, but I've lived in different places. So
Yeah, well, and
London is home now.
as I mentioned in the introduction, you speak 3 different languages, French, Italian, and English. So, and you've reached 10,000 people from LA to Istanbul, I said. So, wow, and you know, I think to that point, the reason I mentioned the international component of what you do, it really doesn't matter where you're from. Everybody has a story, don't we, Beatrice?
Yeah, definitely. I oftentimes say that to my clients and to the leaders I coach, because when I tell them the scary thing that you should share your story, they immediately go, no, I have no story to share.
Oh, yeah, I don't have a story. Nobody would want to hear my story, right?
Which is impossible. Like as long as you have lived on this earth, you have a story to tell. So everybody does.
We really do. How did you first become enamored with storytelling?
I've been trying to explore more of where this came from because I have a background in journalism, so I was used to gather stories from others. But the truth is also that my parents used to tell me loads of stories. My mom used to read me loads of books since I was very little. And then they would tell me the stories of my family in Congo because I wasn't physically close to them. So that was the way for me to get closer to them. And then I studied journalism. I worked as a journalist for like maybe 10 years. And it was very comfortable to, ask questions to other people, gather the stories, and then write them. But then at some point I started working on a documentary series, and the topic was much closer to my personal story because we were covering migration of African migrants in different places of the world. And this one day, one of the people we interviewed, he turned to me and he asked me, "Why are you doing this?" And I was, I gave kind of the corporate answer, like, yeah, because the image of migrants, how they're portrayed in the media, it's not fair, blah, blah. And then he looked at me very serious as if I was giving him like a fake answer. And
Because you were. It was just the corporate response, right?
I
He wanted to
definitely
know
was.
the Beatrice response.
And then he asked me, yeah, but why are you doing this? And I can't even remember what I replied in the moment, but I just had this question in my mind for a very long time. And I started asking myself, why am I doing this? Like, why me and not someone else? And it kind of brought me into this whole of self-reflection and self-awareness where I really had to look back at my story and And the more I did that, the more clarity I had on what I wanted to do in terms of my business, the more I gained more confidence as well. And I realized that that was something that more people, more entrepreneurs, more leaders, more employees should be doing because it relates so much to your confidence, to how you show up in the workplace, how you how you present yourself with your employees, with your colleagues, with your team.
I love it. Yeah. And at the end of the day, it's all personal, right?
Yeah,
You had really what I would call a Simon Sinek moment there, because the why became very
yeah,
personal. And so your why and the corporate why had to align there. And you chose a new corporate why based on that personal why. I absolutely love that. Good for you. I think we all have those moments of transformation where careers morph into callings. And so that's really what I hear from you, is that it's quite personal. So connect the dots between storytelling and a positive work culture for us. How can storytelling help create a positive work culture?
yeah. So the thing about storytelling is that oftentimes when we think about stories, we think about the TEDx talks and the books, and it's very difficult for people in the corporate space to associate those things to their day-to-day work. So the way it connects to the positive workplace, it's really about the core of storytelling. Storytelling is not just about sharing the story, it's about listening to your audience. Then you share the story and then you take action, something else happens. And if you extrapolate those elements from the idea of storytelling, like the performance of the story, then you can apply it in the workplace. So let's say that you have a company, or let's talk about a team. You have a team of people, you listen to them,
Okay.
and you understand what's happening, what's going on, what are they concerned about, everything. Then you share something with them that tells them, okay, I heard what your concerns are. I can relate to that. So you put empathy in it. And then the next step is to take action. And when you do these very simple three things, people feel like they're seen. They feel safer as well. They feel like they can share more openly. And those are some of the elements that create a positive workplace. And then there is obviously the fact that they can share also their personal stories, so they feel more connected to their team members. And one of the things that happen, and I could talk about this forever, but one of the things that happen that is so beautiful is that when you are at work and you have the opportunity to share your personal story, then at some point you realize that even if all the stories are different, the values are shared. And then you have this aha moment. I had this with so many teams that I've worked with. They have this aha moment where they come from different countries, cultures, languages, backgrounds. They have different stories, different gender. And yet they find that they have shared values, and those are the values that brought them to that company. So they have this, oh, so you also share this value. I'm not alone. We can really, really, become more connected. And people more connected, they work better. They have more ideas. They are more innovative as well.
Yeah, and particularly when it's a connection with a noblesse oblige, a great cause that's bigger than any one of us, then we see our daily activity as impacting and furthering that mission that is far bigger than any one of us. I love everything you just said. I want to focus in on the activity, the behavior, the action, right? Right, because that's what we're all about here in Work Positive Nation, is we're going to do one thing today to create a positive work culture. So how do stories uniquely, and of course I'm assuming that they do, but that's just my presupposition, how do stories uniquely prompt us to take action when perhaps a more pedantic approach does not.
Yeah. That's something that has to do with the culture.
Okay.
So I can have a culture where I say lots of things, I share lots of stories, but nothing happens. So there's no accountability. And that means that eventually people working there, they will feel that nothing is happening. So the motivation just go very down, very low, and then it disappear, and then they go somewhere else. So taking action is really about saying it's really simple because it's really about saying something, saying that you're going to do something, and then just do it. It's it's that simple.
Yeah.
Of course, in corporate organizations, the other thing to consider, the other thing to always keep in mind and to also articulate with people is that change always takes time. So it's about, being patient, it's about small steps, and then it's about everyone contributing. It's not that it's going to come from only the C-suite or only from employees. It's something that everyone needs to embody. So it takes time, and that's something that needs to be acknowledged as well.
Yeah, human behavior does not change overnight. It takes at
Oh,
least
no.
2 nights, right? Well, and it seems to me, Beatrice, that the brain is wired to receive stories and to get inspiration or motivation for doing those actions as well as the instruction, even though the instruction may not be as overtly cast as in a more pedantic method or something like that. So how do we, because you just put your finger on something that's so vitally important to me, that is integrity, to ensure that we do what we say we're going to do. And that's the real genius of stories. We get so drawn into them, then the question of whether or not we're going to do it is no longer relevant. I'm going to do it because I'm inspired by the story and I'll run through a wall now, right? So how do we, let's say we notice an inconsistency between what the company is publicly messaging or the stories it's telling, and then the reality. In other words, we're saying we do these things, but in reality, we really don't. Our internal story is inconsistent with our external. How do I, as a HR leader, a culture leader, how do I begin to bridge that gap between what we say and what we do?
Yeah. First, it's something that needs to be discovered in a way. You need to hear that this is something that it's an issue for employees. And oftentimes, unfortunately, lots of the time that happens when employees leave the organization because they either talk about it in the exit interview, they talk about it with the next company or with people with talent who want to join that organization. So it's really about, again, going back to the point one, making sure that you're listening to the audience and to what they're saying and to what they are commenting, what they're not happy about. But then it's about making sure that the culture is aligned. And there is there are obviously two things. One thing that needs to be also acknowledged is the fact that some organizations just enjoy saying what they are going to do or what they're doing, and then just they don't do it internally. And it's not like they enjoy it, but they don't put the same effort that they put outside, but they put it inside, and that's just a fact. But then from the other side, it's also the aspirational story in a way. Like this is where we are aiming to arrive. Okay. And then our internal story is we have to catch up to that aspiration. And I don't think that's a negative approach, but I would always say that because it takes time, it's better that the aspirations are more realistic. And when you share your story, you don't share like all the aspirations that you actually have, but what you can achieve and in how much time. So you need more than the inspiring story. You actually need the team to work on the strategy, to work on the timeline, to work on some key moments as well, and the KPIs and the goals that they're going to reach. So it's not just the performance of the story, but it's also the measuring of the progress.
Yeah, so we want to have realistic goals as well as stretch goals. And I like that, aspirational stories. Yeah, because the stories we tell ourselves really do influence our efficiency, our productivity, and how far towards those goals we get. And the same thing's true of companies. So our big challenge as HR leaders today is, or one of our big challenges is attracting top talent, right? And here I'm not, as Work Positive Nation is, I'm not talking about recruiting, that is trying to sell somebody into coming to work with us, but rather I'm creating a best culture, and I'm realizing that aspirational culture that we're telling stories about, right? And doing my very best. So how do we use storytelling in attracting top talent to join our teams?
Yeah. One of the things that in my researches and writing white papers and doing roundtables, I realize is that the most powerful ambassadors that companies have are their own employees. So if the stories that are told internally, and people are seeing the action shaping from those stories, they will be the first ones to share it with the world and to make sure that there is new talent and that they can be really the ambassadors of the company. So that's one way for sure. The other way, it's definitely to share those stories outside. And there are two considerations that I always make around this, that it's also important where you share the stories, because especially now in these times, and when it comes to attracting really innovative and amazing talent, they are not where they used to be anymore. So it's very the same pools that companies were looking for in the past are not the same right now. So it's important that the message is not shared on the same platform, in the same spaces, in the same areas, in the same neighborhoods and things like that. But then from the other side is making sure that you share those stories to those audiences. But then when the audience comes in, they need to be seeing that those stories were real. So it's always, for me, it always starts from the internal stories. So you work on the stories inside. Some of the employees will become ambassadors for the company in a way. And if not, the stories that you tell outside, externally, will reflect the reality of the situation. So it's a win-win.
Okay, so they become the ambassadors, and so they're telling their stories. Let me tell you what it's like to work here at the Acme Corporation. And those stories are very attractive and tell you about the kind of culture. So once they join our teams, how do we continue this emphasis on storytelling as an integral part of our culture?
Yeah, I like to use this example because I recently went to watch Hamilton and I am obsessed.
It's obsessive, isn't it?
It's an amazing musical.
It is, and it's so action-packed. I mean, you can't get up and go to the bathroom, right? Because you're going to miss a lot.
But one of the things that I noticed when I was re-listening to the songs over and over again.
Oh, I know.
And it's very relevant to your question, is that one of the things that they do in the musical is that almost every single song repeats at least 2 to 3 other songs from the whole musical.
Ah, so it's cyclical. Okay.
So you are never disconnected from the whole idea of the musical, because you always hear parts of it in each song.
Intriguing.
And I think that's the secret for companies as well. It's not just we tell you that we share stories, or we share stories with you when you're joining in, and then that's it. It's more like we share the story with you, so you joined. When you join, maybe your leader tells you a story, a personal story, or maybe you see that there are stories from clients shared around the company, or maybe you notice that the way presentations are made, they really start with a story, and even if there are lots of data, it's data storytelling. So it's not just information, but it's information in the context, so within the story. It's really about making sure that all these clues are consistent in not in everything, obviously, but as often as possible.
So there's a melody that underlies all this.
Yes.
There's a consistency. I love that. As many times as I've seen Hamilton, I had yet to make that connection about this song includes pieces of that song, or maybe I intuitively just fell into the story and enjoyed that.
Exactly, and that's how it should be done. It's something subtle, right? So it's not all over. It's not in your face, but you just notice it. But it's so well done that you don't realize that it doesn't look like an advert or something. It's very subtle.
Well, that goes right back to your mention earlier about culture KPIs. We establish those and we weave them into every piece of fabric in our culture, right? So it's like that golden thread through the tapestry, or to switch back to the musical metaphor, right? It's those three notes, those three culture KPIs or something that we consistently hear in everything that we do, that really draws us in. Beatrice Kabutakapua is my guest on this episode of the Work Positive podcast. Go to the show notes, and there you can go over to her website. We'll talk in a minute about what you'll find there, and also you'll find her LinkedIn profile, and that's how I think she and I first connected and continue to enjoy messaging there. So thank you so much for being my connection on LinkedIn. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So what are some challenges that you've observed, Beatrice, in companies who want to weave storytelling into their culture more proactively?
So there are different challenges that depend on different aspects. But usually it's either that the buy-in from both sides. So there is either like a top-down approach where the C-suite is very into storytelling. They understand the importance, the relevance of it, and then they need to, just make sure that everyone else does as well, which means that they're going to find challenges like people resisting sharing stories, or people not understanding why stories are important. So it's that there will be a lot of educational piece to create, a lot of sharing and training and things that need to give them proof in a way that stories are relevant to the workplace. But also you have to take into consideration that we are all very different in the way we think, in the way we receive information. Some people are more analytical. So for them, the idea of using stories is very, very, very distant.
Suspiciously even. Why should I tell a story? Just give me the 3 points and I'll move forward.
Exactly. So the challenge when the approach is top down is to really make sure that you understand that there are all these differences, and it's not going to be the case that everyone, accept it in an easy way, which is how it should be with every form of behavioral change. Yeah. And then the other approach is the bottom-up approach. So I oftentimes work with internal communication teams, and they really want to convince leaders to share more stories, to be more authentic. but you cannot go to a leader and tell them, share the story.
You
It
will
doesn't
be
work.
authentic.
Can't you
Will
just
be
be a little bit
transparent.
more authentic?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting you should say that, because that's what I'm standing here thinking is we're talking about a culture that has some psychological safety in it, right? Because particularly if I'm talking about how my personal purpose aligns with the corporate purpose, there's a certain amount of transparency and vulnerability that's going to come out in that. So that requires a culture that's, I'll say, relatively emotionally intelligent, right? And
Yeah.
people in my generation, the baby boom generation, some of us aren't very comfortable with that. I mean, I am, but many of us aren't. I'm here to work, and so tell me what to do, give me my job, and let's move forward. So how do you create a psychologically safe environment where not just the intuitives and creatives tell stories, but the analyticals do as well?
Yeah, and that's probably the biggest challenges, because many people have that. Many employees, many leaders as well have that fear of sharing their personal stories. And
Yes.
there are two things to it. One is the fact that when it comes to feeling psychologically safe at work, for some categories of people, it's not that immediate. For Black employees, for women, for people from the LGBTQI plus community, it's not that immediate to just go and share the story because it doesn't feel safe, which is something that I completely understand. But then what I usually say, what I usually tell leaders is that it's not just a matter of sharing your personal story. It's also a matter of knowing what your story is,
Ah,
because you can be in an environment where storytelling in general is promoted, that you are invited to share stories, even if it's not your story. But it's important that every single leader, if they really want to lead from a place of being their own selves, they need to develop self-awareness.
yeah.
And when you look at your own lived experience, when you look at your story, then you develop your self-awareness. And then some behaviors that you might have at work, or some doubts, or some ways also to present yourself at work, you can understand how to manage them. You can understand why some behaviors from other team members, gets on your nerve, because maybe it's not related to
Yeah.
your team member in particular. Maybe it's related to your lived experience. Maybe it's related to how you were raised. Maybe it's related to your parents. And even if it's not the personal story, because that's the idea for leaders. When I say that they have to share stories, they immediately go, oh, I have to share my deepest, darkest secrets and moments.
I'm not
And
talking about that.
and that's really not it. It's not about the traumatic experiences. It's not about the super personal things.
Right.
It's about the journey and the lessons that I've learned. But they need to be the first one to be aware of those. Even if
Yeah.
they don't openly talk about their personal stories, they at least need to acknowledge them.
Yeah. And to become familiar with them, which does require some self-reflection.
Yeah,
And self-awareness, as you're talking about, and then some self-management and being able to listen to others well enough to tell your story in such a way that it's about you, but it's not really about you, because you're seeking to
exactly.
inspire and instruct. Beatrice Kabutakapua is my guest on this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. I mentioned your website earlier. What will we discover when we go to your website, which the link, by the way, is in the show notes if you want to catch that?
Yes. So on my website, on top of working as a business storytelling coach, I'm also a professional speaker. So on my website, you will see video of me speaking, some of the testimonial from the companies and people I've worked with, some ways that people can work with me and how they can get in touch.
Wonderful, wonderful. And as I mentioned earlier, her LinkedIn profile is there as well. Now, you're working on a book. Tell us about that so we can be ready when it comes out.
Yes, I am working on a book. And it's about leadership and storytelling. Surprise, surprise.
Really? You gave away the punchline already.
But it's really about, so a lot of the books on leadership that I've read, and I have this thing where I go, when I do research, is I go into the rabbit hole and I just read everything. But a lot of books that I read on leadership, they are either written from a perspective that's unilateral, or they are written in a way that it's very analytical. So in a way, it's like, you are a leader, so you have to have this skill, this skill, and this other skill. Now go and get the upgrade.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like almost an instructional manual.
Yes.
But obviously we are humans, and that's not how it works for us. So the book that I'm writing is really about giving leaders a framework so that they can use that, they can look into their lived experience and understand, first of all, what type of leaders they want to be, and then also what are their strengths as a leader based on their lived experiences, and how, that's the third thing, how they can articulate the important stories that they have to share with the story.
Gotcha.
So it's about self-awareness, lived experience, and obviously storytelling.
Yeah, I like the way that you're couching that, because when I wrote Work Positive in a Negative World Team Edition, I made it very story-based. I mean, the framework is there, and I talk about the framework and things like that. But I tell stories throughout the book. And so I tell people it's a different type of business book. I tell stories throughout. Beatrice, that's what readers comment on. Hey, that story you told about the horses on your farm, that story you told about your daughter when she did this, those kinds of things. That's what they bring to mind and share with us. So Beatrice, my Work Positive Nation friends always want to know from my guests, so I've got to ask you this. What's one thing Work Positive Nation can do starting today to create a positive work culture?
So the answer for that will be an easy one. I will say that they should share more stories. And I understand that that's not an easy thing to do immediately. So the backup answer to that question is to ask themselves why. I think why is one of the most powerful questions that you can ask yourself when you are trying to be more self-aware, even when you're trying to discover your own story, even when you're trying to share a story, because it helps you to dig deeper, especially if you insist with the why. Why did I get angry at that team member? And then you give yourself an answer. Yeah, but why? And the deeper you dig, the more you will find out. But also because when you ask yourself why, you also ask yourself why is relevant. So I want to share this story. Why is this story relevant? Or my audience, my employees are saying something or are sharing some I heard something. Why? It puts you into the investigative mode rather than the fighting mode in a way, or protective mode.
Right. I love it. Well, and that's certainly a part of your story, because when I ask you how you became enamored of storytelling, interviewing, ask you why, not once, but twice. Amazing.
Exactly.
Oh, Beatrice, thank you so much for joining this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. I'm better for our conversation. I'll have stories to tell my wife this evening about our conversation. And so I just thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your time with Work Positive Nation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. Please share this podcast with your friends who are HR and small business leaders so they can do one thing today to create a positive work culture that increases productivity and profits. I'd like to give you a free Work Positive course just for listening. It's called Something to Talk About, and it's transformed the work conversations of so many people all over the world. Get your free copy when you go to workpositive.today/something to talk about, and you can start transforming your conversations today. Remember, it pays to work positive.